The US election is in.
The United States says it will consider diplomacy.
And a new report shows U.S. inflation.
When learning about U.S. history, where do you start? Do we start as you did in 4th grade with the exploration of Christopher Columbus?
And when Columbus knelt to give thanks for his good fortune, discovering a new shore, a new hope, never knowing what dangers might be lurking there, and he planted his sword in the name of Spain. As he grasped the sand, the soil of his new country, Columbus thanked his men and his queen. But most of all, he thanked God.
Do we start with the Founding Fathers? Do we start with the American Revolution?
The year 1776.
Let Americans disdain to be the instruments of European greatness. Let the 13 states, bound together in a strict and indissoluble union, concur in erecting one great American system, superior to all European influences.
Do we start with the ideas of those who led the first parts of American history?
Democracy has been defined in many ways. We would all agree that democracy includes shared respect and shared power.
Do we focus on our achievements? Do we focus on the things we did great? Or do we focus on those who came before?
Yes, they fought savagely, for they were a primitive people, and self-preservation is a primitive instinct.
They say history is written by the winners, and that's surely the case when it comes to the way Native Americans have been portrayed.
In this early American history course, we'll start at where it should begin, and that is in Native American history, at the very beginning of the history that is recorded within this continent. We will talk about not only the rise of these American nations and civilizations, but also the decline of them. Not to speak of them as mere victims in a background story of American history, but rather individuals who have been interwoven within this American history, an American history that had not forgotten them throughout the ages. Not only do we name 26 of our states after them, but the American history itself is Native American history. And that's what is going to happen in this course. In this course, we are not focusing on the single story, the single narrative that exists, but rather the plethora of perspectives that exist, as being American is not just a color or one group, but of many. And as we tell this story, let it be like a song that has multiple instruments, not just one instrument that plays all through, but an orchestra of multiple different perspectives. Not only Native American, but Black history, not only Black history, but women's history, not only women's history, but Chicano history, not only all of these histories, but all of them together in telling a cohesive story that is the early American history. That is what we'll do in Unit 1. In our Unit 1, we will focus on those rise and decline of the American civilizations that were once before contact with the old world. In our first unit, we'll look at the first interactions and the precedent that is set by Christopher Columbus, not for discovering, but setting the stage of what the relationship between the new and the old world.
Brought home promises to, since these were the Indies, these must be Indians. Fortunately, Columbus had made preparations for this meeting, and with beads and trinkets, the friendship of the savages was soon won. Surely there must be riches in this land, riches which could not be imagined in the Admiral's wildest dreams. The riches of this virgin land were within a handgrasp. Each man had his dream to fulfill. There was gold to be brought home.
See that follow through with further conquistador exploration as we dive even into British and French colonization of the Americas and how distinct each European nation was with different motives for this new land. Not only will we focus on British colonization, but we'll focus on those early interactions between what we call pilgrims and Native Americans, and how such interactions further created a trajectory when it comes to Native Americans within our story. Unit 1 is giving credit for those who don't get credit. Unit 1 is us focusing on the gaps of history that you may not know. As we focus on the connection between the old and new, we'll see that play further out within our lessons in the further units. So let us get started on the stories that we may not remember or the stories we weren't told. Let us divide from what we've been told with what we know now in this contemporary time. Let us dive further in this class into what is Unit 1, which is called When Worlds Collide. Let's get started. I'm Professor Martinez, and this is History Talks. Welcome to your first episode of History Talks. And your first episode is going to be a focus on something called When Worlds Collide, Life Before. This is going to be our recognition of the fact that a civilization on this continent had once existed before the necessary start of what we call American history. But the history of these indigenous people are interwoven with our American history, and we're going to see that throughout our semester play. But in this first episodes, we are going to merely recognize the fact of their existence, achievements, and of course, a insight into the decline of these civilizations in replacement of a new. And that's going to be where we focus on this first episode. If you're looking at my title right here, you're going to see that the beginning of this time period is vague. We really don't know how long these people have been here. We don't know when they all started. We do have historical and archaeological findings to help us have an idea, but that part is uncertain. What is certain, though, is that all of that will change on the year of 1495, with finally the contact with what we refer to as the Old World. You'll hear me use that terminology throughout: Old World, New World. Old World referring to Europe and the previous continents in that area. And then, of course, New World referring to those of the Old World who discovered the existence of another side of the Earth with other continents unfamiliar with. That's what those timelines are going to be, with those terms in mind as well. But let's go ahead and see what else we have in store with us with this first episode. We are going to examine the native societies of the Western Hemisphere before the advent of Europeans. And we also are going to explain the causes for European exploration and its impact of the New World itself. Those are going to be our main focal points today, with these essential questions in mind. Who was here first? Why did people explore? Why did people colonize? And what were the effects of this contact between the Old World and the New World now? That's going to be the things we focus on in this episode. I also like to provide a little bit of like a visual timeline here, just so you can see the extent of what we're going to be focusing on. So we are going to first talk about the theories of how these people got here, but then very quickly go through what is going to be the Spanish colonization or Spanish exploration, with multiple different expeditions, with us focusing mainly on Christopher Columbus as being the main one for us when it comes to our course. Within our lecture, you're going to notice that I'm going to have a few different things on the slides, and typically things that are bolded are things that you are going to need to know for your test in the future. That's going to be like things like, for example, here, the underlying concepts, some of the bolded topics are going to be the things that you need to know about. And I'll let you know what are things that are considered optional as we go through. But let's go ahead and get started, shall we? With the first simple question. When, who, how, those are the basics we're going to figure out with this group of people that we call natives. Now, when is the first part we'll start. Around 50 to 70 million natives had lived in the Americas before Christopher Columbus migrates to the New World. Now, these people had come to the Americas themselves and also migrated, but they migrated from the continent Eurasia around 40,000 years ago. Well, how do we know that? We know this simply because of DNA, archaeological, and historical evidence. These people that we refer to as Native Americans or indigenous have genetic evidence that traces similarities with Polynesians and Asian characteristics. It's interesting because some of the DNA evidence even theorizes about how there was potentially a small, scattered population that once existed here in the Americas even before the Native Americans. Now, that's a lot of theorization that does not have a lot of confirmation, but we are certain of the Native American presence. That we do have clear, definitive on. Now, the question is, how? How did they get here? If I'm saying that they came from Eurasia, from the Asian continent, or further over there, how did they make it to the Americas? Well, there are two theories you'll need to know, and that's what you see here that you should be writing down on your notes. One of them is the Bering Strait theory. The Bering Strait theory is a classic theory. It's the most popular theory. It's a theory that's been around for some time. It's the idea that these people potentially crossed the ice bridge that once existed that must have connected Americas to the Asian continent. Now, if you're thinking in your head, you're like, man, that must have been like a really big bridge. Well, not necessarily. If you're looking at my map in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll notice very quickly that there is a gap that is relatively small between what is now the tip of Russia and the beginning of what we call is now Alaska. That is not that significant, and a bridge definitively was once there. Now, why did they cross? Well, some theorize that it was perhaps that fact that they were following big game. Others had said many other different examples. But what is certain is by 8000 BC, these people didn't just merely settle within Alaska or migrate just to Alaska. They find themselves to have gone through all of North America, all of Central America, and at the very southern tip of South America within that time span. That by 8000 BC, they have made it to all the Americas. Now, that's significant. That's intense to make it that far, to go through multiple continents as they did. So, some have tried to ask, well, how did they necessarily get there so quickly? And how were they able to manage to succeed at that? Well, another theory comes out. Another theory that's also been making some grounds, and this is called the Kelp Highway theory. The Kelp Highway theory is the idea that, yes, maybe some of these Americans traveled by land, but they could have also traveled by sea. This theory suggests that the first Americans arrived not by that land, but by sea, following the coastline of the Pacific Rim of northern Eastern Asia to the Bering region, and then down to the southernest tip of South America. If you're looking at my other map here, the blue refers to traveling by land. The red is what I'm referring to as the Kelp Highway. Them going on the coastal line of the West Coast and following the rich ecosystem that exists on the coastline, and then landing on the shorelines for their breaks and time of rest until they return back to the sea. Definitely plausible. Essentially, both of these ideas could have happened at the same time. But what we do understand is that regardless of how they made it, they made a place of living here. So much so that by 1492, these people had evolved into 2,000 separate languages, thousands of different cultures and tribes, thousands of different religions. They became distinctly unique for who they were and the group that they were with, based on the region they decided to settle. And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that in this next slide. This next slide is the original map of United States in the sense of the Americans first settling in these areas. And their lifestyles absolutely varied. Not many of these indigenous people lived very similarly to others in different regions. They were all distinctly unique based on the different regions that North America has to provide. So, for example, if you were the indigenous population in, let's say, southwest of America, in that yellow, The climate is hot and dry. Therefore, their lifestyle had to vary for those things. Instead of being out in the open fields, they had to be smart with the design of their civilization. So instead of camped out in the middle of the plains, there they will be creating cities within mountains, within the walls. This is called the Puebloan homes, where they were able to build multiple levels of different homes within these rock settlements that they had here, creating cooler conduction and even natural AC for their homes. This would be completely different if we were talking about people who lived in the plains of North America. Plains of North America is me talking about the middle states. And there you would find what you would assume as many indigenous would live, in those teepees, on the open fields. But these people lived vastly different than Puebloans. Puebloans would have been a permanent settlement. They would stay in one spot. While Plains Native Americans would migrate, travel, be nomadic in the sense of them moving with the seasons and the preferred areas, moving along with, of course, animal migration. As a lot of the middle indigenous plains will be utilizing heavily the buffalo populations, following along with it as it is a vital resource for them. This is a completely different way of living compared to if we were talking about the Pacific Northwest. In the Pacific Northwest, if we were talking about the Tillamook tribe, they wouldn't be traveling with the buffalo. The buffalo aren't there. For them, they would use the ocean, and the ocean would be their lifestyle. The ocean would be where they live. The ocean would be what they utilize within their life. They would be using whale bones and different animal bones from the ocean to be able to use within their lifestyle. Vastly different than if we were talking about the Shawnees, the Chickasaws, those of the eastern tribes that once existed in America, that were in dense forests, who were able to manage to make very strong, large, permanent civilizations like the one you see there. Essentially, not all indigenous groups are the same. They are unique, and they are unique based on the region they decided to settle. And that's why it's important that we recognize when generalization can be there, but also when distinct uniqueness is as well. And in this case, there's quite a lot of it. So let's go ahead and start our very first checkpoint. The video is about to pause, and it's going to ask you to answer this question. How did natives come to Americas, and why are they distinctly different from one another? Let's make sure we're both on the same page as you answer that question before we continue. Perfect, thank you. Let's go ahead and move on, shall we? So, we know who they are, we know when, we know how. But what else about their lifestyles? There's something else that we should talk about, and it's the differences between tribes and civilizations. What I mean by this is talking first tribes. There are different kinds of tribes and different kinds of tribe lifestyles. Hundreds of tribes with different languages, religions, and cultures inhabited the Americas. Matter of fact, the U.S. government registered 574 at the peak, which in that time period would be considered a low number for registration compared to what probably really was. But within all of these tribes, they all had different lifestyles. There were hunter-gatherer tribes, warrior raiding tribes, and then permanent settlement tribes. Gatherer tribes. These are people who were nomadic. Nomadic means when people move from a place to another place following those animal migrations or preferred climates based on the season. Just like what we're saying, like the Middle Plains indigenous people who traveled with the buffalo. This would be an example of hunter-gatherers. They constantly move. They do not claim one spot as their own. They move with the necessities of what they need. Then, of course, there's the warrior raiding tribes. The warrior raiding tribes is a culture and tradition of fighting neighboring tribes or weaker tribes to obtain their basic necessities. Typically, these tribes are considered less prevalent and also less of a size population compared to like hunter-gatherers or permanent settlements. These are those who believe in warfare and through violence as a way in which to be able to continue prospering as a tribe. They wouldn't farm, they wouldn't necessarily hunt on their own when they have the ability to take from others. which is the case for some of these warrior raiding tribes. A small population, but a population that did exist. And then, of course, is permanent settlement tribes. Permanent settlement tribes are absolutely different than the other two. This is when people of indigenous people had decided to stay in one spot throughout all the seasons. They did not move. They stayed in one spot. Now, why would they do that? Why would they change from becoming nomadic to then being permanent settlers? Well, it's something that as many in American and human history do, which is the fact that it has to do with agriculture. More prevalent these settlements were when it came to the domestication of agriculture. When humans learned to manipulate plants and food to be able to create crops, this changed the game in the sense of having to move to survive rather than to invest and stay and to continue to farm. This became key for survival for those in the permanent settlement tribes, as they will be using some of the biggest crops they would need to be able to withstand these seasons. And that would be things like, for example, maize or corn. Corn is one of the biggest agricultural commodities that gives life to civilization. Not only indigenous, just overall in human history. Corn is fundamental in many of those ways. And in this circumstance, it's the case as well, along with it beans, sweet potatoes, and much more. Now, it's funny because some theorize that more indigenous people then became more permanent settlers because of agriculture. And it's funny because it's who do you give credit to? Is it really that humans domesticated plants, or did plants domesticate humans? In the sense of corn, which was once a very rare plant among the wild, it is now being created at mass production by a species that finds it vital for survival. Some would theorize that the crops or plants domesticated humans in the sense of providing it the nurturance in order to continue widespread population of their agriculture. It's just an interesting thing, like chicken and the egg, who came first? But all of these are different than what I would call Native American empires or civilizations. Those tribes I just mentioned are largely what is the collection of what we call North American tribes or indigenous people. But then, of course, there's the next level that exists. No different than the other parts of American history in this time period. There is such thing as empires. And there are such things as empires here in the New World as much as there was in the Old World. And this is where some people perhaps don't know. When I'm talking about the empires, these are things like the Aztecs. This is like the Incans, the Mayans, large populations, a civilization at an advanced stage of human and social development and organization, a civilization that may even comprise of many tribes who all have together create this centralized system as they detribalize themselves over time. These civilizations could be so big, multicultural, politically diverse, have a common language, but also have other languages within it. They normally, as a civilization does, occupy large areas of land. While tribes come and go through land with maybe claiming a small territory or region, empires, as you know, claim much land, lots of land. And these empires are no different than those old ones when it comes to the fact of the span of land they were able to conquer. Like mentioning, these are the Aztecs in Mexico. These are the Incans in South America, Peru. These are the Mayans at the Yucatan and the Mesoamerica, Central America. Now, what makes these civilizations just so unique compared to tribes? Well, it really is how advanced they really are. These are advanced technological agricultural developments. To be able to hold on to a large civilization with large populations that could be between 100,000 to millions of people, they had to develop advanced technological developments when it comes to agriculture. These empires didn't all just have necessarily like teepees, if you will, but would have created these stone-carved cities, temples that were large and comparable to the pyramids around the world. These civilizations were highly advanced within the sense of knowledge. They studied math, astronomy, created societies with complex political systems, elaborate religious systems, substantial cities with economies based on agriculture and trade with others. These are far different than those tribes I had mentioned previously, for the fact of scale, advancement, and also way of which of lifestyle. Now, in this week, we will get to highlight and focus on a few of these large civilizations, and we're going to see both the rise and also the decline of these empires that once existed. But as time goes by, these tribes in North America become more developed. They become more solidified in their regions and land. And there are vast amounts of them. In this image right here, I just want you to merely recognize the fact that we have so many of these indigenous populations that had once claimed a piece of North America for their own. Some tribes were larger than others, a collection even, a bands of tribes. Like, for example, if I was talking about the Pawnees or the Blackfoot or the Apache, who were large tribes that were a breakup of multiple little tribes. And then there are your individual tribes there too. But these have large developments and long time of establishing within these areas. Same thing, of course, to go with the civilizations. Before talking about those civilizations, what was the key for natives to develop a more permanent settlement? What was that thing I said, that for a permanent settlement to exist, they must have done this to be able to hold? What was that thing? Perfect. Thank you. And if you said domestication of agriculture or corn being particular, you are absolutely correct. But talking about those civilizations, I just want to show a recognition of them in their prime in this image right here. I already mentioned to you the Aztecs being in Central America. If you're looking right here in the top left-hand corner, we're talking about a population of 5 to 6 million that once existed for around 200 years, creating an elaborate civilization. How elaborate? What about a floating city on a giant lake? That's what I'm talking about as the capital. If you look at this image right here, this is what is called Tenochtitlan, which is the capital of the Aztec Empire, which so happens to be the exact same location where Mexico City is at today. Now, this city was intense. It was considered like the Venice of America by those who had once witnessed it. It was elaborate, not only a floating city on a lake, but even floating farms. These floating farms that had agriculture on this topsoil, where the bottom of the soil was under the soil was water, where they had fisheries that would coexist with the agriculture. To give you a little bit more insight on this floating city, I actually want you guys to click this link that is about to show you on your screen. That kind of gives you a breakdown of the extent of that Aztec Empire, the largest floating city that was once there, and seeing the extent of that power. The Mexica Empire is what they actually called themselves, Aztecs being a word that the old world people gave to these people. The Mexica lived for a long time, until, of course, that contact they had with Spanish conquistadors and the Spanish colonization. Then there's also the Mayan Empire. A Mayan Empire is also intense, 2 to 10 million, high levels of advancement, central of America in what is called the Yucatan Peninsula today. Here, you would have found the Yucatec, who also lived in a very unique climate and region that was once considered inhospitable, where then a civilization existed. The Mayan Empire, not only being impressive for the fact of the climate that they had to conquer, was also famous for the fact that it was the longest standing empire compared to the other two. And then lastly, the Incan Empire, a population of 6 to 14 million people that had existed once in South America, a stretch of what was now called Chile. This is where the empire of the Incans were. they also had a unique land, a unique place. Places like, for example, the famous capital of the Incans, which is called Machu Picchu. It's literally creating cities on top of high altitude mountains. This terrain with agriculture that was able to farm on top of a mountain. This is what is so famous of the Machu Picchu. Success of them being able to live in a land that is considered inhospitable to many, but also for the fact that they were able to do it so successfully for so long. These are the empires that we're going to talk about in this week. And in this first discussion that we have together, you get to pick one of these three civilizations to focus on a little bit more in both recognizing their rise and, of course, their decline. So now that I've kind of explained this difference between tribes and civilizations, let's see if you can answer my checkpoint question. What was the difference between tribes and civilizations? What is that distinct difference between the two that makes them two different categories? Thank you. Let's go ahead and move on to the next topic then. So we have given recognition of these civilizations and tribes, how they got there, who they were. But now, let's talk about the arrivals of the European population. Why do people explore? Why all of a sudden? Why now? Why is it that in this time period, in the 15th century, did the Europeans find themselves on the Western hemisphere of the world? Well, let's go ahead and have that answer figured out. That's going to be, of course, because of two different changes. And those two changes are population growth and commerce. Now, let's give ourselves a quick recap. I know this ain't European history, but let's just try to see where they were in this time period. This is after the bubonic plague, the Black Death, if you will, where 1/3 of the European population died because of diseases. Now, the Europeans are recovering from the bubonic plague. Their populations are rising yet again. And with the rise comes dense populations. Dense populations come with a rise of land value and essentially the lack of it for the population that exists there. On top of that, with the rise again of the European society after the destruction from the plague, you'll see that they're trying to rebuild their economy. And a new merchant class now becomes a reality where they are hoping to seek trade yet again. This results in more trade being done. And in this time period for Europeans, trade was important. It was vital. And the trade that was mostly done was within Asia. Asia and Europe have long time traded in this time period. This is where we get that famous Silk Road trade, where you see the Asian fronts of all of the supplies and trade going directly to Europe, and Europe doing the same back and forth, as you see from my image. But the only thing that's an issue is that trade's about to become blocked. It's about to be less accessible. And because of that, it leads to some creativity of problem solving, if you will. Because trade is increasing yet again, there will be now new advances in navigation. There'll be better shipbuilding that is happening in this time period, so ships can go further and are bigger. And economically, the Europeans need to continue their trade with Asia, regardless of the obstacle that is in between them, which is the fact of the Muslim conquest that is happening within the Middle East. What is called the Moors conquest, essentially the Muslims start to have a claim to land in which the Europeans cannot control that goes in between both Asia and Europe, that is being the Middle East. And that trade now being blocked, you start to see merchants who want to try to find a way to get that direct connection to Asia without having to go through the conflicts of the bloc. And that's where these two ideas, these two reasons, give us the birth of now exploration. So now we understand the why they're exploring. So now let's talk about the who starts to explore and where do they explore. Well, exploration was not a thing that the Spanish were the number one at. There was many other European empires that were also dabbling within exploration. For example, the Dutch Empire has been at exploration for a long time, as they were starting to explore the coastal line of Africa, creating many trade routes and outposts. Same thing with the Portuguese. The Portuguese were also excellent explorers, as they were also exploring Africa and, of course, later on, America itself. This is where you get a couple of classic stories, which you will not need to know any of these explorers besides one person in mind when it comes to these Portuguese explorers. Some that we'll merely recognize is like Henry the Navigator, who does the coastal points among Asia and also Africa, trying to undermine the Arab traders. Then you'll get people like Vasco da Gama, who rounds the Cape of Storms, reaching India. So you do find people who try to become clever in the sense of trying to find a way to get to Asia, which reminds me to show you guys back this picture. If you were European and you were trying to make a trade route with your Asian counterparts, if you were Asia and you were trying to continue your trade with Asia, but your once trade routes like you see here were now being blocked or an obstacle, where would you go next? How would you make your trade route? Well, some of you guys may theorize and say, well, if I'm over here, let's say you're Spain, I could just go all the way down Africa, round Africa, and then go up into Asia. You can. It's possible. It's also incredibly long and treacherous to do so. And many explorers did not find this to be optimal. But some start to say, well, if you can't go around from below and we can't go east, what about west? What is west? That's where those explorers start to aim towards that direction, towards the Western Hemisphere, to try to find out what really is there. So Vasco da Gama was one of those explorers who does do the round trip around Africa, and you can do it. It's just very inefficient and dangerous. Then, once again, the idea comes back out. What about going west? What is west? Now, eventually, you will see some cartologists and navigators who will find very quickly that there is something west. This is later on, if we're talking timeline, where the one person we do give credit to from the Portuguese side is Amerigo Vespucci. Amerigo Vespucci, on behalf of Portugal, sailed to the western side of the ocean and found continents, found land. And this is where Amerigo Vespucci will finally give the name of this new land America, named after himself. Amerigo Vespucci will name these continents Americas. This is going to happen far later on when it's confirmed that they are continents and new worlds. Of course, though, there's a story that happens before that we have to talk about. That's where the Spanish come back in. In this time period, this is where a famous historical figure comes out, which is called Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus is a very controversial character within our stories today, based on what we know and the evidence we have. Now, why is Christopher Columbus an explorer that we will be talking a lot about in this class? Is it because we're giving him recognition of discovering America? Are we giving him recognition for finding out that the earth is round rather than flat? No. There are many ways in which our society likes to think of him, the idea that perhaps he is the man we give credit for discovering the Americas, which also, fun fact, he did not even assume the world was round. He actually assumed the world was a pear shape. Why? Because he believed the Garden of Eden happened to be at the top of the world. And because it was on top of the world, it pulled the gravity into a pear-shaped earth. So we can't give him credit for that. But we will give him credit for something in this class. We will give him credit for what we know, and that is the impact that he had within this contact. And that's where we'll give credit. Not only the impact, but the precedent he sets between the relationship between Europeans and Native Americans. So, why does the man travel? Well, we already talked about how he was looking for a trade route. He was trying to make it to what he was hoping was the Indies, the islands right next to the Asian continent. But how do you get sponsored? How do you get permission to do so? Well, Christopher Columbus went to many to be able to try to get this exploration accomplished. He first went to Portugal, but Portugal looked at his calculations and did not believe the man was capable of doing what he wanted to. They thought that a mutiny was certainly going to happen if he attempted, than them being able to withstand a long journey and finding something at the end. So he's denied by the Portuguese. But that doesn't stop him. And so Christopher Columbus goes to the next place. And in Spain, he has a better opportunity. There is a new king and a new queen who are trying to be ambitious. And this is both Spanish King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Christopher Columbus will convince Ferdinand and Isabella to allow him to do this expedition, to try this thing that he believed could pay off. And after a long travel, that nearly did result into a mutiny, he does discover the Caribbean or the Bahamas. And he not only discovers this land that he assumes is what he thinks is Asia, but he assumes he has found the inhabitants of it too, which are the Native Americans. Of course, he does not refer to them as Native Americans. He does not refer to them as indigenous. He refers to them as Indian, believing he had made it to the Indies. That is what he truly thinks he found. But in reality, this is not the case. He finds something that is far different, and that becomes the multiple voyages that he continues to do after this exploration. Before we talk more about Christopher Columbus and his voyages, I want you to answer this question for me first, which is, why did Europeans come to Americas? What was it that incentivized them to explore yet again? Answer that for me before we continue. Thank you. The following slide you guys see here kind of gives you an overview of the multiple voyages this man will take with his people to be able to get an idea of what was it that he discovered. In the first voyage, it was just 90 men and 3 ships, where they find those Bahamas, like I mentioned, and make contact with who he calls the Indians, but who are actually the Tano people, the indigenous of this land. When he first meets these indigenous people, it's a really interesting encounter, and it's one in which that has been documented within Christopher Columbus's journals, where he talks about how these people who he meets seem unworldly. They come to him and approach his people out of curiosity and also great fear. They have these interactions where the indigenous see the Spanish explorers as out of this world, right? You have to imagine, for these indigenous perspective, these people came on a ship, a large ship. These people are wearing so many different things. They're wearing this metal armor, this hard material. They have these beards. They look distinctly different. They have these horses. They have weapons that have been unheard of and animals that have been unheard of. The curiosity is so intense that even the indigenous, as they have these interactions, will hold a sword by the blade and cut themselves out of curiosity and a fascination out of this new material unheard of. They genuinely thought these explorers were perhaps alien-like or perhaps gods. That's that beginning interaction. Over time, they're going to find out that these people are very human. Not only very human, but have very human intentions as well. Now, what happens here in that first interaction? Simply this. They have their interactions. Christopher Columbus stays for merely a few days. Then he has to head back. He has to head back to report on what he's found. He is going to leave 39 men to guard a ship and to have a post on the island that they're at, which he is now going to name Española. Española is the name of the island that the Tano people used to live at, which is the Bahamas that we call it now. And on his return to Spain, he's going to bring a collection of these new things he found to show his promise that he did find something. That, of course, is gold, parrots, spice, plants, and he will also bring 3 native captives to bring back to the court. Now, it's important that Christopher Columbus is able to convince the king and queen that there is a reason for their investment. And for the Spanish explorers, you're going to see that their main drives are essentially 3 big things. And we call it in this class the 3 Gs. The 3 Gs is referring to the idea that the Spanish only wants God, glory, and gold. If this trip is successful in bringing God, glory, and gold, then it was a good investment. God being in the sense of being able to convert others to their religion of Christianity. Gold in the sense of a very rich commodity in their society, one in which they think is of value to them, which ironically these Native Americans have an abundance of, not as a high value commodity, but rather as a decorative piece. And lastly is glory. Glory in the sense of bringing strength to your nation, bringing strength to the empire through domination and also more territorial claim. That's what the Spanish want. Their motives are simple: God, glory, and gold. The 3 Gs is their drive. So as Christopher Columbus returns back to Spain, he is trying to convince them that these 3 things can happen. And he does so. He shows them these new things. He shows them this new stuff. And he claims that he can create a society in the name of the king and queen in the glory of Spain. He succeeds in this selling, so much so that he gets a second voyage approved. This time, it is 1,500 men, not just sailors, but now soldiers, carpenters, builders, people who are going to develop something, a settlement elsewhere. On 17 ships, this is going to be the next second voyage. Now, the second voyage is going to have a very interesting experience. Their goal is to establish a settlement, to establish the land that they now claim. When they return to Española, they will find that all 39 men that were left behind are gone. They're dead. They're no longer there. Along with them, the outpost and the ship they left behind is destroyed. There's no true understanding of what that story was that led to that, but it is a clear sign that the Tano resistance is there. There had been some kind of issue that happened that led to the demise of those 39 men. But for Christopher Columbus and the shock that was of his findings, this leads to him feeling justified with what he's about to do next. Now Christopher Columbus and these new set of men are on the goal of conquest, and very quickly they will conquer Española from the natives as they start to Christianize and colonize in the name of Spain. And this is where you start to get Christopher Columbus, who does some very controversial things. As he establishes this new settlement, he also demands tribute from the Tano people, and he will force the Tano people to have to bring him gold or silver or face punishment if they do not do so. This is where he creates this exploitation, and this exploitation is something that we're going to focus on a little bit further, because it is this exploitation that leads to the precedent of what is the relationship between the New Worlders and the Old Worlders, between Europeans and Native Americans. Christopher Columbus is very aggressive in the sense that he will get what he wants. For example, if Native Americans, if the Tano people did not bring him the gold that he expected, the capita amount, the quota they were supposed to bring in, the punishment would result to the cutting off your hands. Or, as a capital punishment, they would cut the tip of the nose of the Native Americans So the main blood vessel would keep spewing and bleeding out to a slow death. This is the extent of what punishment looks like under Christopher Columbus. But it doesn't just end there. Eventually, there is a lot of widespread abuse. There is a widespread of raping, widespread sexual abuse of not only women but children, a widespread of destruction against that community, where eventually the future explorers and conquistadors will inherit Christopher Columbus's direction and also have their lines of punishment, punishments that are unheard of, like killing children slowly or burning a collective group of Native Americans over a pit of fire. This is the devastation that exists with these Spanish conquistadors. Eventually, Christopher Columbus will have his way and have the dominance of this island. He'll eventually create a fort and city that is called La Isabela, the name after the queen. And he leaves behind, yet again, but this time with his two brothers in charge. And Christopher Columbus's brothers will be also doing the same level of abuse that they had seen and will continue to the next level of it. Then, of course, there's the third voyage. The third voyage gives you 200 men and 6 ships. The third voyage has a different experience for Christopher Columbus. This time, he goes to a different part of the New World when he comes back to the Western Hemisphere. This time, he'll reach South America as he plants his flag in Venezuela. Then he'll return to La Isabela in Española, where he will find very quickly both Tano and European immigrants who have become resentful of the rule of Christopher Columbus and his brothers for their harsh treatment and mismanagement. This mismanagement becomes big. It becomes then eventually publicized and sent back to Spain to the courts to find out about the handlings of this investment. They become an outrage for them. So much so that eventually Christopher Columbus and his brothers will be required to come back to Spain, arrested for their mishandling as a governor. This seems to be the end of Christopher Columbus, where now he's in a prison. Now he is locked up for his handlings. But that doesn't last long. The fourth voyage eventually happens, where eventually Christopher Columbus will find a way in which to convince an audience with the Spanish courts to release him and to allow him to go on another voyage. This time, he's promising some far-fetched things. He tells the courts that he was on the mists of finding something big, something great, and if they free him, he will go find that thing he was so close to finding. This was a stretch, but enough for him, where he was able to be freed. But there was a couple of contingencies for him. He was told he was not allowed to return to Española. And even with that the case, he tries when he gets to the New World again, but gets denied entry. He then goes and explores the Caribbean in different areas. But then he fails at establishing another post when he makes it to Panama. Because of both native resistance, climate issues, he has to give up. And he tries to return back to Española, where eventually he will find himself in a position where he will be marooned in Jamaica with his 2 ships that were left at that point. Months go by. He's eventually saved from his maroonment. And at this point is the end of Christopher Columbus's legacy. It's the legacy, the impact he had with these interactions, the extent of how much he did, and the relationship is something that not only will the next conquistadors follow, but the other Europeans will follow as well. When we talk about the British colonies, we will see some overlap of this set emotions, the set impression of how we should treat these other people. Are they even people? Should we deem them as people? Are they subhuman? If they're subhuman, does that mean we get to treat them as such? These are the kind of things that start to be the next conversations after Christopher Columbus has done what he did. And folks, there's something else that Christopher Columbus did far as legacy. And that is something that you need to know for this class that is called the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is simple. Within the multiple different interactions between the New World and Old World, there is a mixing of things. Things that either one side did not have versus the other. And in this exchange is some positives and, of course, some negatives. What I mean by this in the Columbian Exchange is that Christopher Columbus introduces new things to the Old World, things that have never been brought to the Old World before. Things like squash, sweet potatoes, corn, avocado, peanuts, potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco, cacao beans, vanilla, pineapples, peppers, turkeys, and pumpkins. These commodities are now things that could be new markets and industries to profit off of. In exchange, the Old World gives something to the New World. These are things that were unheard of for the New World, like coffee beans, onions, olives, citrus fruits, bananas, grapes, sugarcane, grains, wheat, rice, barley, oats, livestock that was never here in America before, like cows, sheep, pigs, and horses. Those are things I don't think a lot of us assume because we see them all the time, especially in the Central Valley. But those are all Old World materials. Those have never existed here, but then now are. And many of these things have positive and negative things. Like, for example, when you introduce a new animal to an ecosystem, it damages the ecosystem. The biological ecosystem cannot handle the new entry of an invasive animal or plant. And that impacts a lot of things. Or about the impact of diseases. The Old Worlders brought something else. They brought smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria, whooping cough. These things are perhaps the most damning of them all, because these are the things that will lead to the demise of the Native American populations that I told you had existed in North America. It's not only the aggression that comes from European colonization, it is the disease that eliminates the vast majority of Native Americans. It leaves themselves weak and vulnerable, so much so that it would not take much for their defeat. And that is what comes with the Christopher Columbus Exchange, is the fact that it brings further the demise of these people, not only when it comes to autonomy, but when it comes to liveliness, when it comes to wellness, as eventually the Spanish will use this as an opportunity to continue their conquest into this land. Before I have you guys do this checkpoint, I do want to give you guys a little bit of a video that gives us a little bit more of an understanding of what is Christopher's legacy. That's what I want you guys to do on this next video before I have you answer a question about it. Thank you for watching that video. I appreciate it. And now you can answer this question. What significance and impact did Christopher Columbus have on the Americas? What should we give this man credit for? What is it that he did when it came to the New World? Perfect. Well done. And now we're getting to the last parts, folks. We talked about the setting of the stage that comes with Christopher Columbus, and then I mentioned his legacy, the legacy that continues with other Spanish explorers and conquistadors that follow. And that's what this next part is. We've already talked about why the Spanish are doing this. Those 3 G's, remember? God, glory, and gold. But that precedent he sets is so strong. And you're going to see that be the case in our week's discussion, where you get to focus a little bit more of the rise and falls of some of these empires because of the conquistadors. I'll merely just acknowledge one of them here, but mostly talk about the impact. This is going to be the Hernando Cortés. The Hernando Cortés, a conquistador that conquers the Aztecs, or the Mexica Empire, if you will. This is a crazy story, a story in which has so many parts to it. And if you choose this part, if you choose this empire to focus on, you'll see what I mean. But when it comes to this one, it's really the long-term impact that Spanish colonization has on the Americas. For example, when Cortés conquers the Aztecs, they embed these new laws, religion, language that then becomes the laying foundation for the conquered people in this area. The Spanish, as they continue to exploit this land and people, will start to embed these new laws, religions, and languages on these people, a way in which transforms them into something that relatively looks like today. What I mean by this is, for example, like the caste system. The caste system is a Spanish law system, a Spanish class system where it ranks people based on their race and their family's history within this Spanish rule. When the Spanish take control, they find a way in which to make sure that their control and ruling is permanent for these people. And the way they do so is by implementing these laws, religions, and languages that would embed the foundations of what life would be like in this territory. For example, when the Spanish start to control the Aztec Empire, they start to force intermarriage. They start to force marriage and force procreation so they can create a race in which blends the two. And in these blendings of races, in these intermarriage relationships, they start to create something called the caste system. The caste system is a class system that ranks you at level of prestige based on what kind of person you are, based on your race and family history. So, what I mean by this is like the image you see to the right. When the Spanish start to force procreation with the indigenous, this is where you start to get new ethnic groups in the world. This is where you get the idea of a mestizo. A mestizo is half Spanish, half indigenous. Now, the word mestizo might not mean much to you, but what if I said Mexican? That's what we call these people now. If you're somebody who subscribed to the identity of Mexican, congratulations. We're talking about you. We're talking about the beginning of your ethnicity as a either by choice or not by choice interracial marriage between the conquistadors and the indigenous. But this caste system doesn't stop there. What happens if a mestizo starts to have a relationship with a Spaniard? That creates a whole other thing. What happens about the slaves that start coming in? What happens when a slave starts to create a relationship with an indigenous person? And what is the ranking that comes with that? That's what this image kind of shows you. It shows you the levels of tiers that are created. A tier system in which that creates a permanent connection and interweaving between these two groups that were once considered colonizers and colonized. But it's not just about the interbreeding or intermarriages that they create. It's also the fact of the encomida system that the Spanish create under these occupied people. These are things like, for example, the ideas of forced labor or tribute that these new occupants now must do. These are the things that will be forced upon the indigenous that were once here. The Spanish, if you're looking at my picture in the middle with the map, start to claim much of Central America and parts of North America as well, and the Caribbeans. They start to have a strong foothold, one in which would stop around New Mexico when they have a hard time trying to convince another group to be able to join. Eventually, they will be halted with their progress of expansion by the Puebloans in New Mexico. And the ideological clashes between these groups is great. And it's going to be a difference and a fight between Christianity and natives' religion, or native lifestyle versus Spanish lifestyle. But from here on out, the changes will not be any different. But from here on out, the Spanish will hold this land for decades and decades on, where they will continue to change it into a society that looks similar to the one you see today. This is Spanish colonization. This is the extent of what it looks like when you mix the old with the new. But that's just one European country and one example of colonization from the Europeans. What about the others? What about the British? What about the French? That'll be for our other episode. But for now, answer this checkpoint for me. What impact did the Spanish colonization have on the Americas? Answer that question for me before we continue. Thank you. And like I said, folks, congratulations. This is the end of this episode, as we were merely recognizing the rise of the indigenous civilizations and, of course, its first interactions with the Old World that led to their demise with the Spanish colonization. In our next episode, we'll focus a little bit on American history with the fact of the ideas of the first colonies that are established by the British. But for now, folks, that is it when it comes to our history talks. Thank you guys so much for going through your first episode. I hope you learned something new. I'm Professor Martinez, and this was History Talks. Thank you, and have a good day.